The cold came slowly, like a rumor that turned out to be true. At first, it was just longer winters, then rivers that froze too early, then herds that didn't come back, and then one morning, the frost didn't melt. Not on the bark, not on the bones. It just stayed. And so did we. We didn't have a name for it. There were no ice maps, no forecasts, no government warnings, just a growing understanding passed from breath to breath. The world was shifting under our feet. And those feet, cracked, wrapped in sinew and hide, kept walking. Not because we were brave, because we were stubborn. And perhaps because we didn't know how not to. The old man said the mammoths used to come from the east. Then they stopped. Then the snow covered their trail. Then someone else said they saw their tracks again, far west, near the long stones that point at the sun. No one argued. You didn't argue with stories. You carried them. So we moved. We moved in small bands, dragging sleds made of bent wood and bruised hope. We followed rivers that hadn't frozen solid, hills that still grew grass in defiance. Sometimes we found old campsites, rings of stones, charred bones, a broken spindle. We whispered thanks to the ghosts and claimed nothing. What was left behind belonged to whoever needed it next. Travel was not a journey. It was an argument with the land. One moment it fed you, the next it swallowed you. The wind changed directions like it had opinions. And just when you thought you understood the rules, a glacier coughed and erased the valley behind you. Still, we learned. We learned how to read the language of footprints, fresh hooves, frightened scat, snow disturbed in spirals. We learned that snow can lie, hide lakes beneath a crust of deceit. We learned which mushrooms talked back and which ones kept you warm. We learned, reluctantly, that sometimes even your best spear isn't enough to bring down a beast with a coat thicker than your entire clan's wardrobe. And in all this, we found time to laugh. We laughed at the boy who mistook reindeer tracks for his own, at the girl who fell into a snowdrift and emerged hours later with an entirely new hairstyle, courtesy of ice, at the old hunter who swore he once winked at a cave bear and lived to tell the tale again and again and again. There was power in laughter. It made the blizzards sound like jokes. It made hunger seem negotiable. It made us believe that even though the world had turned white and wild, we hadn't yet lost the game. We weren't alone out there. Other clans, other wanderers, they crossed paths with us in the strangest ways. Sometimes at a distance we'd see smoke and pretend we didn't. Other times we exchanged fish for stone, song for fire. We told stories, then promptly stole each other's cleverest lies and retold them in our own fires like they were ancestral truth. And amidst all of it, there were the dogs, or wolves, or something in between. They started showing up, trailing us at a distance. Not quite tame, but not quite wild. They were smart enough to wait till we were asleep to steal bones, and smart enough not to take too much. Some say they chose us. Others say we chose them. But either way, we both decided to tolerate each other's smells and mistakes. A perfect start to any long-term relationship. What we didn't know, what we couldn't have known, was that we were becoming something new. Not just survivors, but memory keepers, pattern watchers, time markers. We began to notice not just where the sun rose, but how high. Not just that the moon returned, but when. We were building something fragile and vast, awareness. The kind that doesn't help you right away, but later, when you least expect it, might save you. One boy carved notches into a mammoth rib to count the days since his sister vanished into the snow. A woman arranged beads in spirals around her infant's ankle, claiming space on the body for beauty. An old man told the same tale 3 different ways, each one truer than the last. These weren't just quirks. These were blueprints. We didn't call it art or science or culture, but it was the beginning of all 3. And somewhere in those first fire-lit circles, someone must have asked the question out loud, half smiling. What if the ice never melts? No one laughed, because the question lingered like smoke. Because in our bones, we already knew the ice was not passing through. We were passing through the ice. And that's where this story begins. Not in triumph, not in tragedy, but in motion. A slow walk into a white world with nothing but flint, furs, and the foolish belief that we could outlast the cold. Which, somehow, we did. We thought we were alone in the cold, but then we found the footprints. Not ours. Too narrow, too clean. They moved with intention, curving along the edge of the frozen ridge like they'd been there before, like they knew what came next. We followed them, not out of trust, but because they pointed somewhere. And in a world of endless white, even the suggestion of direction felt like a gift. That night, as the snow piled higher against the mammoth-hide walls of our camp, someone whispered a story about the first ones who walked before us, the ones who spoke to stones and listened to trees. It wasn't told with reverence. It was told like a warning. But in the morning, the tracks were gone. No one panicked. Disappearance was common. People, trails, even mountains sometimes. You learned not to grieve too fast, just in case the snow gave something back. So we kept moving. It wasn't migration, not in the way animals migrate. It was more like drifting with purpose. A hunger-led dance. Reindeer to salmon to roots to nothing, then back again. Patterns began to emerge, though no one would admit them aloud. Saying you knew where the herds would be was a quick way to get blamed when they weren't. Instead, we watched. The color of the lichen, the angle of birds in the sky, the strange way the wind sounded different when it came over rock instead of snow. These were not superstitions. These were early science, wearing a fur cloak. Sometimes we traveled together. Sometimes we split. Small groups moved faster, starved slower, but the split always came with stories. Who had a vision, who dreamed of red sky, who claimed a deer antler pointed west in its final breath. Whether true or not didn't matter. Truth in the Ice Age was measured in survivors, not facts. And through it all, we left things behind. A sharpened blade, too precious to carry after an injury. A child's bead string dropped during a sleep-heavy march. A man too tired to move who told us to walk ahead. We did, but not without binding his hands with red thread, not without singing to him as we walked. Some losses were necessary. Some became stories. But not all signs of others were so sad. Once, in the mountains, we found a circle of stones surrounding the remains of a fire. In the center, a carved antler. Not ours, not local. The carving was crude, a spiral within a spiral, but someone recognized the pattern from a tale her grandmother told, a tale from the West. It meant people were out there, not just living, but marking, remembering, responding. And then came the wall. Not a wall like the kind cities build, but a cliff face hidden in a crevasse, dry and shielded from wind. On it, animals. Painted, carved. Some simple, some astonishing. A bison mid-step, a lion curled to leap. Not just symbols, but motion. Shadows frozen in pigment. We touch them. Not out of disbelief, but something quieter. Recognition. Someone asked how they made the paint. Someone else said, blood and ash. Another whispered, maybe they just asked the stone. We didn't laugh. You don't laugh at magic you don't understand. You carry it carefully, like fire on a wet day. That night, we made our own mark, a handprint. Palm full of ochre, blown across with breath and hope. It wasn't art. It wasn't message. It was proof. Proof that we were here, that we saw, that we responded. In the morning, the storm had cleared. The cliff remained. So did our handprint. We moved on. But now, we watched differently. Every ridge might be a canvas. Every crack a message someone once began and left for us to finish. We began to carry not just tools and food, but ideas. Someone shaped a bone into a flute. Someone else found a rhythm in footsteps on frozen grass. And suddenly, silence wasn't the only sound anymore. We had music. We had patterns. We had memory. The ice was still merciless. It still took more than it gave, but now in our packs, alongside dried meat and flint, we carried a carved bead, a small antler figure, a song half finished. We didn't know it yet, but we had started building something bigger than shelter. We were building culture.
It didn't start with a plan. It started with rhythm. A stick tapped against bone. Once. Then again. A child hummed to the beat. Someone else added a whistle made from hollow reed. And suddenly, in the middle of the ice, there was something that didn't come from hunger, cold, or fear. There was music. We didn't know what it was. No one named it, measured it, or claimed it. It was just sound with memory inside it. A way to keep time when there was no sun. To fill silence without wasting words. A way to say, I'm still here, even when everything else was gone. In the dark, music did what fire couldn't. It didn't keep us warm, but it kept us from falling apart. At first, the instruments were makeshift. Drums made from stretched hide, rattles filled with teeth and pebbles, pipes made from bird bones. But they didn't stay simple. Some were carved with spirals and animals. Some were tuned with astonishing care. We learned to bend air into shape, to press story into sound. And the stories followed. Because once there is rhythm, the tongue begins to move differently. The pauses mean more. The words remember how they felt last time. You don't just say, the hunt went badly. You say, the beast turned and the sky forgot how to be blue. That's not exaggeration. That's history with teeth. So language took shape, not as a tool, but as a ceremony. You sat by the fire and someone began. You knew the first line before they said it, but still you listened because it was never the same twice. That's how you knew it was alive. The best storytellers weren't always the strongest or the oldest. Sometimes they were just the ones who noticed things others didn't. The color of a deer's eye before it bolts. The the way firelight dances on cave walls like it's remembering something. They weren't just tellers, they were keepers. They held names, maps, warnings. They remembered where the river swallowed the child, where the snow crust could not hold a man's weight, where the tree with twisted roots marked a cave mouth no one entered twice. But they also held wonder. Stories of the first snowfall, which wasn't white but blue, of the stars as holes punched by a bear's claws, of the moon as a woman who keeps forgetting where she left her child. We didn't care if it was true. Truth was for later. Story was for now. And through it, we began to believe in things we hadn't seen. Not gods, not yet, but signs, patterns, shapes in smoke, dreams that meant more than rest. One boy dreamed of a giant bird with human eyes. The next morning, a wind came from the north and brought back the herd we'd given up on. No one said the bird caused it, but no one said it didn't. Dreams became a kind of second life, one that ran parallel to the waking world. You could stumble across something in sleep and return with it in your mouth. A name, a direction, a fear you hadn't named before. Some people dreamed more clearly than others. They were quiet during the day, watched shadows too long, started fires with strange rituals, 3 sparks, 2 breaths, no talking. They weren't called shamans yet, but we stepped aside when they passed, not because we were afraid, because we weren't sure what else we might be stepping into. They wore feathers when no birds flew, painted their faces with patterns not found in nature. They claimed they heard the snow humming, and sometimes, when they laid their hands on a fevered body, the shaking stopped. We didn't understand it, but we understood that it worked. And in a world where almost nothing did, that was enough. So we began to listen more carefully. To the wind, the animals, each other. We learned to mimic the calls of reindeer, to echo the bark of foxes. We told stories through gesture, marked trails with stacked stones and knotted threads. We painted with ochre, not because it was pretty, but because it lasted. Everything we did was starting to have a second purpose. A hunt was not just for food, it was a pattern of motion, a ritual, a memory passed in muscle. A carving was not just decoration, it was presence, a shape that said, "This creature matters." And firelight became theater. Shadows on stone became movement. The walls of caves began to fill. At first it was simple, a bison, an antelope, a hand. Then came scenes, movement, layers. We didn't invent art, we uncovered it. The way you uncover a frozen carcass, carefully, breath held, heart racing. And in doing so, we began to understand something dangerous and beautiful. That survival wasn't the only thing we were here for. That even in a world built of ice and silence, we wanted to leave something behind besides bones. We wanted to be seen. And so we painted, sang, danced, carved, not to pass time, but to pass ourselves forward. To say, this is what we feared, this is what we chased, this is what we loved, and one day someone will find it, and maybe, just maybe, they'll understand.
The first time someone buried the dead with care, it probably wasn't for spiritual reasons. Maybe it was just practical. Keep the wolves away, keep the smell down. Or maybe it was emotional. Grief without language, just hands in silence. Either way, the moment passed unnoticed. No one declared, "We have invented ritual." They just dug. And they remembered. But over time, those burials began to change. At first, it was a little extra. A carved bead, a tooth, a handful of ochre smeared along the cheek. Then a bone pendant, A tool placed just so. A body curled like it was dreaming, arms folded, head turned toward a mountain no one had climbed. Someone sat there a long time after the last breath left the body, arranging. Not cleaning, not hiding, marking. We began to recognize that the dead still meant something, that they still took up space, not in the tent, but in the mind, that they haunted not through noise, but through absence. And with that came the first flickers of something deeper, the idea that death wasn't the end. There's no evidence of priests, but there were patterns. Graves that faced the rising sun, children buried with objects they never used, infants wrapped in fur and ochre, as if coloring their exit could soften the blow. These weren't just acts of love, they were signs. Signs that memory mattered, that the dead were still part of the camp, just quieter now. Some graves were simple, others were astonishing. At Sungir, a child was buried with over 10,000 beads, each painstakingly carved and polished. The beads weren't for show. They were sewn onto a tunic that would have taken someone hundreds of hours to finish, hours they didn't have to spare, and yet they did. Was the child sacred, royal, or just deeply loved? We can't know, but we know this. The moment that tunic was stitched, someone chose to invest in grief, to give time to sorrow, to decorate a moment they hoped would never come again. Burial became not just an ending, but a message. You are gone, but we are still here, and we remember. Eventually, people began to return to those graves. They left objects, they whispered, they walked circles. We don't know the words they used, if there were any, but we know the patterns. The footprints repeat. The ochre deepens. They built memory into the land. But the Ice Age wasn't gentle. Sometimes you couldn't stay long enough to bury properly. Sometimes the ground was too hard, the predators too close. Then came sky burials, placing the body on a raised platform, returning it to the birds. Not abandonment, offering. Other times the bodies were burned, ashes scattered or collected, placed in bone containers or tucked into cave crevices. Fire purified, or maybe it simply erased what was too painful to carry. But even the burned were marked. We found them, remains arranged with care, symbols etched nearby. A sense that someone was trying to make sense of it all, to give shape to loss. And sometimes, the dead were not left behind. We found burials within camps, beneath hearths, beside sleeping areas. Some were infants, others elders. It wasn't morbid, it was presence. Memory literally underfoot. You cooked over your grandmother. You dreamed beside your son. You lived with ghosts not as intruders, but as kin. And in that closeness, we see the rise of ancestor worship. Not in the formal sense, no altars, no commandments, just a growing belief that the past could guide the present, that memory had power, that blood wasn't the only thing that tied people together. Story did too. It's no coincidence that the places with the richest burials also contain the most art. Where people remembered their dead, they also painted the walls. They sang more. They carved more. Grief became creation. It still is. A carved figure placed on a grave isn't just mourning, it's hope. That someone might carry on, that the shape might last, that beauty might outlive breath. Sometimes the carvings were animals, sometimes abstract spirals, sometimes female forms with wide hips and blank faces. Not portraits, symbols of fertility, of endurance, of life pushing against the frost. We called them Venuses, but to those who made them, they were something else. Maybe they were prayers. Maybe they were reminders. Maybe they were just something to hold on to. Because when the world gives you snow instead of answers, you shape your own. And somehow we learn to shape matter from absence. A grave wasn't just a place to cry. It was a place to return to mark the cycles,
to retell the same story in a slightly different way, each time a little closer to the truth, or at least to a version of it that helped us keep walking. Even now, we dig up their bones and feel the urge to interpret. We assign purpose, we imagine grief, we hear echoes, because we know, somewhere deep down, that the need to bury, to mark, to mourn isn't about death at all. It's about memory. And memory once shaped becomes culture, which is how we moved from marking graves to marking everything else. Symbols on beads, spirals on antlers, dots on bone. A language forming not in words, but in repetition. In the next step of the journey, those marks begin to speak, not with grammar, but with pattern, power, and portable belief.
At first, the marks were just scratches. A line here, a notch there, a groove cut into a piece of bone, evenly spaced, then repeated. Maybe someone was counting days, maybe just keeping their hands busy. But over time, those marks began to multiply. They curved, spiraled, interlocked. Some were carved on ivory, others painted in ochre. And suddenly, it wasn't just marks anymore. It was memory, made visible. We hadn't yet invented writing, not officially, but something in us had already started trying to trap meaning in shapes. We couldn't stop the wind, or the snow, or the animals from vanishing, but we could leave a pattern behind. And patterns matter, because once a mark is repeated, once someone else copies it and says, yes, that means something, it stops being personal. It becomes shared. It becomes language without sound. Some of the oldest artifacts show this shift. A mammoth bone carved with notches in repeating intervals, a baton etched with chevrons and dots, spirals that appear across caves hundreds of miles apart. These weren't accidents. These were signals, breadcrumbs, proof that thought was trying to hold hands with time. We were beginning to tell stories that didn't need a voice. Of course, most people still preferred a good fire and a louder tale, but these symbols, these portable pieces of meaning, they were different. They could travel without forgetting. You could carry them across a glacier. You could die, and they could remain. They were the first whispers of permanence, and that changed us. Because once you start thinking in symbols, you start to see them everywhere. The tracks of an animal become a message, the twist of smoke a sign, the phases of the moon a calendar too complex to ignore. One day, someone noticed the way the full moon always came after the river cracked open. Another person began scratching circles into a piece of antler. A third added a mark every time the ice melted enough to gather water. And suddenly, we weren't just surviving the seasons, we were predicting them. We had invented time. Not in hours or days, but in returnings, in patterns, in the reliable dance of things greater than us. And those who noticed the dance first became powerful. They didn't call themselves seers or wise ones. They didn't need to. Others called them that, in silence, with their eyes, because the one who knew when the herds would come, when the stars would rise, could turn uncertainty into action. We began to gather around those who remembered best. Not just the strong, not just the lucky, but the ones who carried patterns in their heads like others carried fire in their hands. They became walking archives, living calendars, memory made flesh. And their words began to carry weight. When they scratched 3 dots in the dirt and said, "Wait," we waited. When they painted spirals on a stone and said, "Not here," we moved on. Not because they ruled, but because their guesses came true more often than ours did.
Slowly, without anyone announcing it, memory became a kind of currency. Those who remembered the deepest winters were listened to when the skies changed. Those who remembered the last famine could dictate when the next hunt should begin, and those who remembered nothing followed. But this wasn't hierarchy, not yet, not the rigid kind. It was still loose, fluid, like the snowdrifts we slept beneath. Respect wasn't inherited, it was earned, usually the hard way. Still, patterns have a tendency to accumulate. And so do the people who carry them. Soon, those people had more beads, more tools, more voices around the fire turning toward them. Not because they demanded it, but because we gave it. We were creating a new kind of structure, not built from mammoth bones or stone, but from influence, a social architecture. And we didn't even know it. The people who knew things weren't always right, but they were right enough. And sometimes that was enough to matter. We began to ritualize memory, to treat certain days as different, to mark the first snowfall with silence, the longest night with extra flame. We didn't write these traditions down, we burned them into our actions. Over generations, those actions hardened into habit, and habit became belief. Some of the symbols began to carry weight beyond their shape. A spiral wasn't just a mark, it was a promise that things come back. A handprint wasn't just decoration, it was protection. A row of dots meant a safe passage, or a warning, or both. We began to believe that symbols had power. And once you believe something holds power, you start to treat it like it does. We carved them deeper, painted them higher, wore them on our bodies. One woman etched a pattern into her tooth. A man tattooed his knuckles with dots. We found bones buried with symbols carefully carved at the ends, marks no one would see unless they were meant to be seen by something else. By this point, we weren't just surviving the ice, we were learning how to negotiate with it, how to fold ourselves into its rhythms instead of fighting them. And that negotiation required meaning, required memory, required marks. Because when the sky was blank and the future uncertain, a scratched line in bone could feel like a promise that someone had been here before, that someone had endured, and that if we just followed the pattern, maybe we could endure too.
It began with circles, walked, not drawn. A group of travelers stopped beneath a cliff, and instead of collapsing by the fire like usual, they began to pace around a central stone, in silence, clockwise, then counterclockwise. No one explained it, but everyone followed. Someone sang, not a song with words, just a sound that rose and fell in a way that made the snow pause. It wasn't performance, it was invocation. We were inventing ceremony. Not in the name of gods, not yet, but out of instinct, the need to mark something that didn't leave a scar on the land, but one in the memory. What were we honoring? Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. A birth, a death, a return, or simply the fact that we had survived another week. Sometimes survival alone demanded a celebration. And so ritual took shape. Someone arranged stones in a line, perfectly spaced. Another sprinkled ash in a spiral. Someone placed a carved animal figure beside the fire, not for warmth, but for presence.
These were not casual gestures. They were offerings. To the land, to luck, to whatever force had allowed us to wake again. This wasn't religion, it was rehearsal. We were practicing reverence. And slowly, places began to matter. We stopped thinking of caves as shelter alone. Some became sacred, not for comfort, but for quiet. We returned to them season after season, not because they were easy to reach, but because something stayed there. A feeling, an echo, a presence. Inside, we didn't just eat or sleep. We lit fires that cast stories on the walls. We traced old paintings with reverent fingers, not to restore them, but to remember them. We added to them carefully, like footnotes to an older text. The walls became layered, a palimpsest of presence. And some spaces weren't for everyone. In the back of certain caves, where the ceiling dropped and the light barely reached, we found handprints smaller than a child's, painted in red. Beside them, no footprints, no torch residue, just silence, pigment, and the unmistakable feeling that these were meant. Who made them? Why? Maybe it was a rite of passage. Maybe it was isolation. Maybe it was art without audience. Or maybe some rituals were private. Because as the world grew colder, our inner lives grew deeper. We began to divide space, here for eating, here for sleeping, here for memory, here for the unseen. Some places were marked with bones, others with pigments, others with nothing at all. Just the agreement that this was not like the rest. We didn't yet believe in gods with names and faces, but we had already begun to believe in boundaries. And boundaries became stories. One night, a woman dreamed of a bear who spoke like her brother. She awoke crying, then laughing. She refused to walk west again. That night, the wind changed, and an avalanche fell where we would have camped. Coincidence? No one said the word. But no one walked west after that. Dreams began to carry weight. If someone dreamed of fire, we watched the skies. If someone saw their dead brother in a river, we moved upstream. We didn't say we believed, but we acted like we did. And belief, like fire, doesn't need your approval, only your fuel. So we gave it gestures, repetition, markings on skin, songs sung only in a certain rhythm. Each act made belief more real. One man always turned to the left before a hunt. One child refused to eat the heart of an animal. A woman carried a pouch of teeth, not her own, but whispered to them before sleeping. None of these behaviors were taught. They were caught. Belief moved faster than speech. It jumped from breath to breath, shadow to shadow. It lingered on shared objects. A carved figure passed from hand to hand without explanation. No one knew who made it. No one wanted to be the one to drop it. And when the carvings broke, because sometimes they did, we didn't discard them. We buried them. Not like trash, like bodies. Because they had meaning, or maybe more than meaning, presence. We had begun to think that some things could hold more than what they were. A piece of ivory shaped like a swan was no longer just ivory. It was a link, a threshold, a door. To what? We didn't know, but we knew it mattered. So we began to shape things more deliberately. Lines that followed lunar cycles, symbols that repeated across different objects, dots and rows, chevrons, branching lines. Some carved into antler, some etched into cliff walls, others painted on smooth stones and carried in slings for months. We weren't just decorating, we were encoding. But for whom? For each other? For the dead? For something bigger? We didn't ask. We just kept marking, singing, walking in circles when the rood struck. We moved through ritual the way we moved through snow, carefully, repetitively, always with the quiet knowledge that something invisible had weight. And somewhere in the distance, past the next ridge, beyond the melting glacier, someone else was doing the same. We hadn't met them yet, but we already spoke a common language of rhythm, of symbol, of memory made tangible. And soon our scattered patterns would begin to converge, not into cities, not yet, but into something just as powerful: shared space. The kind that needs more than one fire, the kind that demands a beginning, a boundary, and a name.
The first time we met strangers, it wasn't a battle. It was a negotiation. Quiet, cautious, half frightened, half curious. Two groups stood across a stream, hands visible, weapons sheathed, but not far. No words at first, just gestures. The language of animals who didn't want to fight, but didn't trust not to. One woman stepped forward with a bundle, dried meat or roots or a carved shell. No one remembers what exactly. What mattered was the offering, not the gift itself, but the fact that she gave it first. The other side responded, slowly, deliberately. They mirrored the gesture. It wasn't a transaction. It was a test. Could fear become exchange? And it did. We'd stumbled into something new: contact. The world had felt empty for so long, just us and the animals and the cold. But suddenly, we weren't the only ones scratching symbols into bone or painting hands on rock. The strangers had their own marks, their own gods or fears, their own way of singing. It sounded different, but familiar in its intent. And so began the drift from isolation to interconnection. It wasn't always peaceful. There were tensions, mistranslations, resources too scarce to share. But more often than not, we chose to trade instead of take. Why? Because the strangers had things we didn't. Antlers shaped differently, stones that sparked better, a way of binding hide that didn't leak. They had ideas, and ideas were now more valuable than fire. So we began to travel not just to survive, but to meet, to learn what others had learned. Suddenly, the world expanded. Routes emerged, not roads, but paths worn by feet and memory. Across tundra, over rivers, through forests now returning as the ice began its slow retreat. These weren't migrations. These were migrations with intent. We met others who spoke with more clicks, others who painted with manganese instead of ochre, others who thought wolves were ancestors, and others who thought they were thieves. We didn't always agree, but we always watched. Watching became a new kind of listening. We carried their tools back to our camps, their gestures, sometimes their people. Mating became alliance. Children carried mixed customs in their blood. The first true networks were not made of rope or trade, but of kinship. Not all meetings were planned. Sometimes you stumbled upon another group's cave in winter and had to decide whether to knock or run. Sometimes someone disappeared during a hunt and reappeared 3 moons later with new tattoos and a different word for sun. We began to collect words like we collected beads. And in time, those words began to shape identity. Not just who we were, but who we weren't. Us and them wasn't always hostile. Sometimes it was just accurate. We sleep with fire inside the tent. They sleep with it outside. We bury our dead curled. They stretch theirs flat. These differences mattered, not as judgment, but as orientation. In a world with more than one way to live, how you lived began to say something about who you were. And with that, something strange and new emerged. Culture with contrast. We weren't just surviving, we were choosing how to survive. Some groups painted animals, others painted symbols. Some danced in circles, others walked lines. Some never spoke aloud the names of the dead, others chanted them every new moon. It wasn't better or worse. It was divergence. Evolution not of the body, but of the mind. And trade accelerated it. We traded shells from the coast hundreds of miles inland, resin from faraway trees. We traded stories of floods, of stars, of beasts with too many eyes. We traded lies, too, probably. Every culture has its exaggerators. But even lies carry truth about what people want to believe. And what we wanted to believe was this: that the world was bigger than our campfire, and yet somehow still connected to it. That even though the stars above the other camp weren't our stars, they still shone for them. And that meant something. We started marking trails, not just with stones, but with symbols that others could read. A spiral scratched into bark meant good water. 3 dots meant this way dangerous. A handprint meant we were here. We made it. The land began to fill with signs. The Ice Age, once wide and blank, was now scribbled with meaning. And soon, we began to plan not just our days, but our seasons. Where we'd go next, who we'd meet, what we'd bring. Calendars were still only in heads or in notches on wood, but they were growing clearer. And for the first time, we looked at a place not with the question, can I survive here, but with something bolder. Can we build something here? The answer wasn't always yes, but the fact we were asking changed everything. Because when you start asking what can last, you begin to dream of what comes next. Not just the next hunt, the next generation.
The moment we stayed longer than a season, something shifted. It was subtle at first. A fire pit rebuilt in the same spot, a storage pit dug deeper than usual, a ring of stones where a child liked to play, returned to again and again. Then one year, we didn't take the tent down. We patched it, reinforced it, added another post, another hide. We had paused migration, not completely, not forever, but long enough for the snow to notice. The reindeer kept moving, but we didn't follow. Not this time. We'd learned to fish, to trap, to dry food with smoke and patience. We started planting roots, literally and otherwise. Not yet agriculture, but experimentation. We scattered seeds where we had dumped waste. Some grew,
Others didn't, but we remembered which ones tried. And so, without ceremony or decree, we took the first awkward steps towards settlement. We began to notice things we hadn't before. The slope of the land in spring melt, which trees creaked before the storm, which stones held the most sun by midday. We mapped without drawing. We remembered with our feet. And we began to think in terms of return. The site was no longer just a camp, it was a place with history, with ghosts, with expectation. You couldn't just walk through it, you had to respect it. We started naming parts of it, not with official words, but with gestures and jokes. The place where Mako fell in the mud. The rock that looks like it's judging you. The good fire circle, not the one that smokes, the other one. Names gave shape to place, and places gave shape to time. We began to think ahead. If we stay here through winter, we'll need more wood. If we store the dried meat here, it won't mold. If we keep the children away from the bog, we won't lose another one this year. Caution became custom, custom became habit, habit became infrastructure. We dug trenches to drain meltwater, we built racks to dry skins faster, we created midden piles, organized waste, without knowing the word for organized or waste. We were building systems, primitive, sure, but systems nonetheless. And with permanence came responsibility. Nomads don't leave much behind. Settlers do, and what you leave behind, you must care for, repair, protect. So we built fences, not to keep things out, but to keep our things in. Tools had owners now. Hides were claimed, stored, sometimes fought over. Space began to divide, not by lines, but by familiarity. You slept where you had always slept, ate where the cooking stones were warmest, sat beside the same people when the stories began. Community became geography. And with geography came tension. Staying in one place means decisions. Who tends the fire? Who mends the walls? Who speaks for the group when another band appears on the ridge, holding spears and wearing too many necklaces? We didn't call them rules, but they felt like rules. And from rules came mistakes. One man hoarded roots meant for everyone. Another refused to share a deer he hadn't killed alone. A woman built a windbreak too close to the smoke vent, nearly suffocating half the camp. Each problem was new. Each solution improvised. Sometimes we argued, sometimes we shunned. Sometimes we joked so hard that no one remembered to be angry. Humor, it turned out, was the first justice system. You could insult without bloodshed. You could correct with laughter. You could diffuse shame with a well-timed snort. And for all our attempts at order, the camp remained alive. Messy, surprising, constantly negotiating with itself. We still hunted, still traveled, still moved when the land demanded it, but now we always returned. The old sites began to layer with meaning, bones buried deeper, paintings retouched, carvings added to old stones like signatures on a shared song. We began to decorate permanence. A hearthstone painted red, though it had no need to be. A fence post carved with animal tracks. Beads tied into a child's braids, not for luck, but because they looked good. The idea that function alone was not enough had begun to root. Beauty, once reserved for survival's leftovers, was now creeping into the center. Even our tools changed. A spear that once had to pierce a mammoth's hide now needed to impress your neighbors, too. Craftsmanship flourished. Not mass production, there was no market yet, but prestige,
pride, a silent contest of skill. You knew who made the best arrowheads, who cured hides softest, who told stories with their hands while they worked. And work became more than necessity, it became identity. He's the one who makes bone flutes. She's the one who traps birds with 2 stones and a string. They're the ones who know when the ice will crack. Knowledge began to specialize. Not everyone had to know everything anymore. You could depend on each other, which meant you could go deeper into your own craft. Better tools, better food, better shelter. Better stories. Because with time comes storytelling not just of what happened, but of why it matters, of ancestors, of meanings layered like snow, of warnings and triumphs and ridiculous moments no one should forget. The time we thought the bear was dead, the night the fire sang, the day 2 children disappeared and came back with 4 dogs. And in these stories, something radical emerged. The belief that we belonged not just to the land, but to each other. That staying wasn't just practical, it was personal. And personal, it turns out, is where civilization begins.
It started with a wall. Not a tall one, not the kind meant to keep armies out. Just a circle of stones, waist high, dry stacked, around the edge of a shelter. Meant to block wind, maybe, or wild dogs. But once it was there, it stayed. And once it stayed, so did we. The idea of territory began to crystallize. Not in conquest, not yet. There were no armies, no kings. But you could see it in the way people moved, slower near certain stones, reverent in certain groves. Boundaries formed without fences. A shared glance could say, that part is theirs, or we don't camp there anymore. Land had begun to matter differently. Before, land was either useful or not. You passed through it. You remembered where the roots grew, where the elk rut, where the storms always veered. But now the land started to carry more than memory. It carried ownership. Not with paper, with presence. If you had stayed there last winter, planted your fire pits, buried your dead, left your marks on the cave wall, then it was yours. Not forever, not in blood, but in rhythm. Return was a kind of claim. So when others came, it wasn't a raid, it was a negotiation. Sometimes they asked, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they were kin, sometimes not. But always something had to be said. A gift, a gesture, a story shared before the deer trails were discussed. Hospitality became a performance. Not fake, but deliberate. You offered food not because you had extra, but because it told the guest, we are not enemies. You placed your tools where they could be seen, but not touched. You smiled. You didn't relax. It wasn't paranoia. It was protocol. And when you left someone else's camp, you told a story about it, whether it went well or not, whether the food was strange, whether their children stared too long. You passed on intelligence the way you passed on fire, carefully, without dropping it. Social complexity had arrived, not in hierarchies yet, but in networks. Who knew whom? Who owed what to whom? Who had wronged whom 3 winters ago, and whether that had been resolved or just politely ignored. And with complexity came status. It wasn't just the best hunters anymore who commanded attention. It was the best speakers, the peacemakers,
The ones who knew how to listen without nodding too much. The ones who could remember 6 different family lines and where their trails had crossed. Knowledge became diplomacy. And diplomacy required memory. So the stories got longer. Now when someone told of the cave lion they'd escaped, they added details. Who they were with, who saved them, who didn't. Which clan had warned them 2 weeks earlier and deserved to be thanked even indirectly? The stories weren't just for entertainment. They were records of alliances, of debts, of social tension folded into laughter. And beneath the laughter, something else stirred. Expectation. Certain people were expected to speak first. Others to carry the meat, others to decide when the group moved, when it stayed, who joined the hunt. Not because they were stronger, because they had done it well before. Leadership was being invented quietly. It wasn't absolute. It was situational. A fire tender could command attention in the cave, but not in the woods. A tracker's word carried weight until the hunt ended, but slowly preferences emerged. Some people just got listened to more, and those people began to act like it. Not tyrants, not yet, but confident, a little less patient with disagreement, a little quicker to assign tasks. They wore necklaces of teeth, not because they were richer, but because others gave them the teeth. Power was subtle, but power was growing. And then one season, someone died. Someone important. Not just mourned, but remembered differently. Their tools were buried with them, their beads passed to no one, their name spoken with a pause, their space left untouched for a year. It wasn't sainthood, but it was memory with ritual. And ritual, once born, rarely fades. So we began to mark not just the dead, but their roles. This one was our dreamer. That one was the elk caller. This one ended the feud between the twin clans. We began to organize our memories, not just chronologically, but structurally. Who were we without her? Who takes his place? Those were new questions, and they didn't have answers yet. So we tried things. Gathered for decisions, took turns, created councils that met only when it snowed or when the food ran low. Not rules, but experiments in cooperation. Politics, before we had the word. It wasn't clean. People argued. Families whispered. Alliances formed over shared hunts, broken over burned meat. But the important thing is, we tried. We were learning that surviving together wasn't the same as living together. That once you stay in one place, you don't just build walls. You build society.
The seasons began to blend. Not into monotony, each still brought its own sharpness, its own needs, but into expectation. We no longer watched the skies in panic. We planned. Winter was for mending, spring for tracking, summer for gathering and building, autumn for storing and preparing to forget the sun again. Time had become something we could predict, not just endure, and that changed everything. Planning requires memory, yes, but it also requires imagination. What hasn't happened yet must feel real enough to influence what you do today. So we began to tell stories about the future. If the snows come early, we'll move to the red cliffs. When the geese flow low, the lake will crack early this year. If you dream of wolves 3 nights in a row, wait to hunt. We didn't call it forecasting, but that's what it was, provisional prophecy wrapped in folklore.
and some were better at it than others. A man with a broken leg learned to watch the sky. A woman who no longer bled learned to track roots by their smell. People who once would have been left behind found second lives in foresight. We began to value thought as much as action, and with thought came refinement. Our tools, once good enough, became excellent. Spear points fluted for strength, harpoons barbed for hold, snares designed not to kill, but to trap cleanly. We stopped just making tools that worked, we started making tools that worked beautifully. Function fused with form. You could look at a bone hook and know who carved it. Style became signature, preference became school. We began to specialize not just in what we made, but how we made it. One man's arrows flew straighter. One woman's tanning never cracked. Another could carve 4 beads from a single sliver of mammoth ivory, and each would be flawless. This wasn't ego, it was evolution. Human style. Iteration by memory, mastery through repetition. And mastery wanted to be shared. So, we taught. Children watched, then helped, then led. Not all of them. Some had no patience for flint or hide or thread, but others took to it like breath. They learned faster, changed things, improved. The first apprentices weren't chosen, they chose themselves by staying nearby, asking questions, mimicking silently. And the masters, eventually, let them. Knowledge was no longer just survival. It was inheritance. And inheritance brought permanence. Not everyone needed to know everything anymore, because now someone did. A specialist, a keeper, a teacher. With that, knowledge stopped dying with the body. It stayed. In others, in habits, in shapes and symbols passed down like blood. We began to trust in something greater than memory. Continuity. And continuity required community. So we gathered more often, not just in emergencies, but for the sake of gathering. The first festivals were probably practical, communal hunts, seasonal fairs of barter and song, but over time they grew more unnecessary, and therefore more important. We came together to witness each other, to sing a song that only made sense if you knew the joke from 3 winters ago, to watch a dance that mimicked the moon or the elk, or a child learning to walk. We made time for joy, and joy made space for identity. We began to dress differently, not just for warmth, but for meaning. A spiral stitched into a shoulder meant you had seen the northern lights. A red feather tucked into a braid meant you had walked alone for a full moon cycle and returned. Paint wasn't just for ceremony, it was for presence. We were inventing style, and style was contagious. We borrowed from each other. A carving technique from the Western bands, a tattoo pattern from the coast, a rhythm that migrated faster than the people who taught it. Culture became a conversation that spanned distance without needing permission. And all of this required something new. Memory outside the body. We began to build containers, not just for food, but for knowledge. Pouches with painted symbols, stones stacked in encoded positions, bones carved with notches that marked moons or milestones. They were portable libraries. Not always accurate, not always understood, but they existed. And as these objects multiplied, so did our sense that we were part of something larger. Not just a clan, not even a people. A story. One that spanned generations, that remembered more than any single person, that carried songs your mother never sang but your grandmother's grandmother did. And if we were part of a story, then that meant the future mattered. So, we began to prepare for it. Burying caches of tools, teaching names to children they hadn't earned yet, marking trees with warnings about rivers that hadn't flooded in years, but surely would again. This wasn't superstition. This was strategy. Because for the first time, we were living not just in response to the world, but in conversation with it. And the conversation had just begun.
The first shelter, made from stone instead of hide, wasn't meant to last forever. It was just meant to last through one winter, maybe two. The builder probably didn't think much beyond that. Just needed something that wouldn't flap in the wind or sag under snow. But stone is patient, and it remembers. The next year, someone else returned to that same spot, rebuilt the wall, added a roof from branches maybe, left a carving near the entrance, a handprint, or a cluster of dots. Not a signature, but a suggestion. We were here. We made this. You can too. And so shelter became architecture. Not the kind with blueprints or columns, but with intent. You didn't just throw hides over a frame. You designed a space where smoke would go, where light might fall, where the children could sleep without getting stepped on. We began to shape our surroundings to reflect our priorities. And our priorities were changing. Space wasn't just for surviving anymore. It was for being, for gathering, for storing not just food, but objects that meant something. A decorated bone, a bead made from a rare shell, a carving that made someone laugh. Every camp became a museum, a shrine, a memory palace. Walls weren't just barriers. They were canvases. We painted inside them, not just animals anymore, but shapes, dots, spirals, patterns that had no obvious meaning and yet appeared again and again across hundreds of miles. This was not randomness. It was shared symbol. And with symbol came abstraction. We were beginning to think in ways that didn't require direct reference. You didn't need to draw the deer to talk about the hunt. A single spiral could evoke the turning of the seasons. A line of dots could speak of absence. A triangle might mean woman, or fire, or danger, or all three at once. Our brains were stretching. We were learning to live in metaphor. And as we did, we built not just homes, but spaces of belief. Some were simple, a circle of stones aligned with the sunrise. Others were more elaborate, caves deep in the earth, only accessible by crawling, where the walls pulsed with red pigment and the air felt heavy even without wind. These weren't practical places. They were meaningful. You didn't go there to eat or sleep. You went there to feel, to listen, to bring your questions, and sometimes your silence. Not everyone could enter. Some spaces were marked, not with signs, but with stories. Only those who have touched the bones may go. Only the women after the moon returns. Only the dreamers. We were creating ritual architecture. Places designed not to protect us from weather, but to open us to something else. And that something else was starting to take shape. Call it spirit. Call it energy. Call it the thing behind the thing. We didn't have a word for it, but we behaved as if it were real. We made offerings. We whispered names. We avoided certain trees, certain rocks, certain corners of the cave where the echoes were too slow. And from this, the first myths were born. Not stories of things that happened, but of things that explained. Why the sun returns, why children come with the rain, why wolves howl on clear nights, and fish leap during snow. These were not guesses. They were frameworks, ways to hold mystery without fear. And as mystery deepened, so did hierarchy. Certain people, those who dreamed vividly, who entered the caves and returned changed, who knew which herbs soothed the birthing woman or stilled a shaking child, became something more than skilled. They became different. Not rulers, not yet, but threshold walkers. Shamans, healers, visionaries. Their words weighed more, even when they made no sense. They spoke of things no one else could see, and then, somehow, those things appeared. A storm, a sickness, a new birth. Coincidence? Maybe. But in a world ruled by chance, any pattern that repeated felt like power. And power, once recognized, tends to grow. So these people were listened to, fed first, given space, given secrets. The knowledge of plants, of poisons, of pathways through grief. Knowledge became guarded, not hoarded, not yet, but curated, taught only to those who proved worthy, through ordeal, through vision, through silence. Initiation was born, and with it, lineage. You didn't just become wise, you were brought into wisdom through ritual, through dream, through scar and fire and bone. And thus, the first institutions appeared, not built of stone, but of repetition. The pattern of passing on what matters most with reverence. The idea that some knowledge is not for everyone, that the sacred is not just what helps you survive, but what changes you without needing to. And somewhere, beneath a cliff painted in ochre, beside a fire that never quite dies, someone draws a symbol. Not for food, not for shelter, not for story, for meaning. And that, more than anything, is the mark of civilization.
We had always sung, but now we began to compose. Not just songs for rhythm or for remembering the steps of a hunt, but songs meant for occasions. A child's birth, the first thaw, a healing that held, a loss that wouldn't. Our voices stretched to meet those moments, bending melody into memory, and memory into belonging. Music became ceremony, and ceremony became structure. There were songs you didn't sing alone. Harmonies that only made sense when voices stacked like the stones we built into walls. We danced in circles, not for fun, though it was, but for cohesion. A rhythm shared was a rhythm that kept us together. Culture wasn't just evolving, it was congealing. You could leave for months and come back and still know what time it was by the pattern of feathers in someone's hair, the carvings on the doorposts, the way a bowl was held before it was filled. These weren't habits anymore. They were customs. Customs with teeth. Because not everything could be changed now. Some things were set. If you spilled water during a moon ceremony, you apologized. If you took too much from the communal pile, you gave back double. If you wore the wrong beads to a morning song, well, you just didn't. We had rules, unwritten, but everywhere. And with rules came those who watched them. Some gently, elders who coughed just loud enough to remind you to wait your turn. Some sharply, women with hawk eyes who remembered what your mother had forgotten. Some with humor, the old man who told your mistake is a funny story every time you walked by. But they watched, because now there was something worth guarding. Continuity. We had begun to think beyond the generation. Not just what the child would need, but what the child's child might want to know.
So we taught deeply. Stories had layers now. Lessons braided into jokes. Warnings disguised as riddles. A clever child might hear a tale a dozen times before realizing it wasn't just about a fox and a mountain. It was about betrayal, about patience, about power. Power was no longer raw. It was crafted. Not the strength to lift or kill, but the ability to influence, to shape, to maintain the balance of a group bigger than one fire circle. And so, leadership began to solidify. Still fluid in some places, yes. Still earned, not born. But now there were names whispered longer. Decisions deferred to certain voices. The word ours said only when they had said it first. There were leaders who did not hunt. Their hands were clean, but their minds were heavy. They remembered who owed what to whom, who was grieving whom, who was still angry about the broken spindle from 3 winters ago. Their job wasn't to provide, it was to weave. Society had threads now, and someone had to keep them from tangling. These leaders weren't rulers, but they had gravity. When they sat, people adjusted their bodies. When they laughed, others laughed too. When they frowned, children stopped whatever they were doing, even if they didn't know why. And still, underneath all of this, the earth kept shifting. Literally, glaciers melted, rivers changed course. The animals that had once guided our migrations were moving differently. Some vanished. Others appeared in new herds, new coats, new behaviors. We had to adapt. Again. But this time, we had infrastructure. Not just in stone and bone, but in trust. In the systems we had built of trade, of knowledge, of shared story. We weren't just reacting anymore. We were responding with strategy. A flood was met with raised walkways. A new predator with new traps. A failed harvest with redistributed stores. We had backup plans, contingencies, people who specialized in solving problems that hadn't yet arrived. We had invented resilience. And resilience needed something more than reaction. It needed belief. Not in the gods, necessarily. Not all of us had those. But in each other. In the idea that we were more than individuals trying not to die. That we were a collective with purpose, a trajectory, a future. So we began to think monumentally. Not just in objects, but in effort. Someone dragged a stone larger than a bison into a clearing. Others helped. No one knew what it would be yet. A grave, a marker, a place to watch the sun split the mountains each spring. Didn't matter. The act of building it was the point. We were saying, we were here. We mattered enough to shape the world. Let time prove it. And then came the moment that changed everything. Someone asked, what happens if we never move again? Not this winter, not this generation. What happens if this here is the place? It wasn't just a question of food or shelter. It was a question of identity. And once asked, it could not be unasked. Because now every rock we lifted, every pattern we painted, every child we named, carried a different weight. Not just survival, legacy.
The answer, as it turned out, was yes. Yes, we would stay. Not just through the season, but through time. Not just because it was safer or warmer or closer to the river, but because it meant something. We had fallen in love with place. And with love comes work. The first permanent settlements weren't grand, they were clusters. Huts shaped in rings or half rings or spirals if someone fancied a bit of flair. We built close, for warmth, for chatter, for surveillance of toddlers, of storms, of each other. Every home needed a hearth. Every hearth needed fuel. So trees fell, one by one. A few birds vanished. Then the deer began to avoid the valley. We noticed, but not fast enough. Staying had consequences. Nomads don't overgraze. They leave before that's possible. But settlers? We were writing the first environmental impact report, one pile of stripped bark at a time. So we learned, slowly, painfully. We let certain groves regrow, rotated grazing, planted what we couldn't find enough of, onions maybe, grains if the land liked us back. We watched what birds nested where, what insects arrived with rot, and we adjusted. Adaptation became management. And management required cooperation. One family can track the reindeer. A camp needs schedules, shared labor, expectations, which meant meetings, which meant politics. Real politics. Voices raised, eyes rolled, fingers pointed. But at the end of the argument, someone still had to dig the latrine pit, and someone had to decide where the goats would wander tomorrow. Democracy? Not yet. But we were learning that fairness wasn't always about equal. Sometimes it was about clear. So we began to keep track. Not on paper, on memory, on objects. A string of carved stones to track who had borrowed the axe. A row of painted marks to show which child had fed the dogs. Accountability via artifact. And somewhere in this tangle, we stumbled into property. Not just in the sense of mine and yours, that had always existed, but mine even if I'm not using it, yours even if I want it, ours, but only during harvest. Land itself began to carry names. This ridge belongs to the red-footed family. The pond behind the high tree is watched by the Whispering Clan. The West Field is for everyone, except during Moonbirth Week. It sounds chaotic. It was. But it worked. Most of the time. Until it didn't. Because the more we invested in place, the more we had to lose. And so the first thefts happened. Not of objects, that was old news, but of intention. One group moved their fence a little too far. Another built a smokehouse on contested soil. Another claimed their ancestors had always walked a certain trail, even though no one could quite remember it that way. Conflict moved from survival to principle. We didn't fight over fire, we fought over meaning. And that was new, because you can't hunt meaning, you can't eat it. But once you believe in it, you'll fight for it harder than any piece of meat. We developed conflict resolution. Not courts, not yet, but councils, rituals, mediators, one elder from each lineage, one stone passed hand to hand until someone made a joke sharp enough to disarm the tension. Peace, it turned out, was a skill. And like any skill, it required tools. So we invented neutrality. A space where no one slept, a circle where no weapons were worn, a fire that everyone could sit around without claiming it. Diplomacy became architecture. And in the quiet between disputes, something else flowered. Identity. The settlement wasn't just a place anymore. It was us.
The way we built, the way we danced during first rain, the shape of our pottery, the style of our jokes. You could tell where someone was from by how they whistled while they worked. We had become distinct, which meant others were too. Strangers arrived more often now, sometimes in peace, sometimes not. Some stayed, some left, some disappeared, and every encounter left a trace. An idea, an object, a child with a new kind of laugh. Cultural fusion wasn't just tolerated, it was inevitable. Our tools showed it. Handles shaped like no one local shaped them, arrowheads of unfamiliar stone, songs with rhythms that didn't match our steps at first until they did. And with every outsider, we redefined insider. Who belongs? Who decides? How long must someone stay before they are part of the we? These weren't easy questions, but we asked them repeatedly because we had chosen to live in time now. To stay meant to remember, and to remember meant to record. We didn't invent writing yet, but we carved longer, painted more densely, arranged objects in sequences that meant things only we could decipher. Our homes became texts, readable not with eyes but with presence, a bead pattern that told of a good harvest, a notch sequence that recorded the winter the river froze over the fish traps, a child's handprint beside a bear claw etched in black, the year the two met, and both survived. We didn't yet know what we were building, but we knew it was bigger than a village, bigger than a season, bigger than survival. We were building civilization's memory, one gesture at a time.
We began to dream in permanence. Not in abstract terms, cathedrals or dynasties or empires, but in stone, in line, in rhythm. What had once been a seasonal campfire was now a plaza, though we didn't call it that. A wide space cleared not by chance, but by choice, where people came to talk, to trade, to settle disputes, to flirt, to boast, to belong. The hearth had become a square, and the square had gravity. Other huts clustered around it, then workshops, then granaries, low sloped structures half buried in earth to keep the rodents out and the roots cool. Someone built a platform just high enough for a person to speak from. Then someone else climbed it and refused to come down until their cousin returned the goat he'd stolen. We had stumbled into public life. No one had planned it, but once it existed, it demanded a shape. You couldn't just say things anymore. You said them there, in the middle, in the open, in front of others. That was new. So was the need for record. Someone began scratching marks into clay, not for art, but to count. Bags of grain, number of hides, who owed whom what after last year's feast. Not full sentences, just symbols, enough to say, this happened, this matters. From memory to ledger, from story to account. It changed how we saw time. Now it could be measured, compared, stored. It had weight, not just rhythm, and that meant history had begun. We didn't know the word, but we felt its pressure. The past was no longer just behind us. It was underneath us, layered, archived, wrapped in smoke and echo and stone. Every building we raised was atop someone's ashes. Every field we plowed held a bead, a bone, a whisper of what had come before. We had to choose, preserve, repurpose, or erase. Most of the time, we chose all three at once. We buried the old hearth
under the new wall. We planted over the graves of ancestors, but only certain crops. We moved the path because the spirits whispered through the moss on the rocks. Or maybe someone just stubbed their toe too many times. Superstition. Maybe. But it worked, because we were trying to balance something we'd never had to before. Scale. There were simply more of us now. More children, more disputes, more baskets and bowls and broken bones and laughter. Growth had momentum. You couldn't stop it. So you shaped it, like a potter with clay spiraling under your palm. We built roads, not paved, but clear, trampled, predictable. We built gutters for rain, storage pits for grain, ladders for roofs. Not because anyone told us to, because someone had to. Specialization exploded. Some people never hunted. Some only dug clay. Some just healed the sick, or tried to. The healer no longer needed to know how to flint knap, and the potter didn't know which mushrooms would kill. We were weaving a net of mutual dependence. And it worked. Until it didn't. Because now inequality crept in. Some had more. Of what? Food, tools, influence, children who didn't die, beads that sparkled just a little more. People noticed. They always do. At first it was just pride, then envy, then structure. Those with more began to act as though they were different. They weren't, but they were treated differently, which, in time, made it true. A hut with 2 fire pits, a child with 3 tutors, a woman who never fetched her own water but always had the last word at feast. Status had calcified. Not entirely, not always, but enough. And in its shadow, resentment grew. Quietly. Until one day, someone refused to give their share. Or someone took too much. Or someone died and their body was burned alone. And no one quite knew why. And we had a rupture. Not a collapse, not yet, but a crack in the clay that had held us together. One that wouldn't close easily. One that asked, what do we owe each other? We had no answer. So we danced harder, told longer stories, made bigger fires, built taller cairns. We ritualized the fracture, hoping meaning would seal it. And in doing so, we created the first myths of justice. The trickster who steals the grain but returns it as bread. The child who speaks the truth the elders would not. The spirit who weighs the heart against a feather, not for judgment, but for balance. We were trying to write an ethics, without laws, without gods, just rhythm and repetition and reminder that we are not only what we build or what we keep, we are what we share. And still, through it all, we stayed. We planted, we repaired, we laughed when the wind knocked over the priest's offering post. We invented sarcasm, probably. Someone painted a lopsided mammoth on the meeting house wall, and no one corrected it. Because permanence, we were learning, doesn't mean perfection. It means presence. And we were very, very present.
It ended the way most beginnings do, not with a declaration, but with a seed. A mother planted barley where wild grass once grew, not because she hoped it would rise, but because her daughter asked if it could. A man carved a mark into a stone, not to honor the past, but to remind the future that he once stood there, alive, laughing, seen. We didn't announce the dawn of civilization, we just kept waking up in it. The village had a name now, or maybe several, depending on who you asked. One word for the outsiders, another among ourselves, and a third whispered only during ritual. It didn't matter which was true. What mattered was that names endured. So did paths and stories and disputes about where the old fence line had once run. Every scrap of memory became heritage, whether it deserved it or not. We built not because we needed to anymore, but because we believed in continuity. A house for your daughter, a kiln for the potter's apprentice, a stone bench by the trail where someone could rest and watch the sky unbuckle itself into stars. These were not acts of desperation, they were acts of faith. Faith in tomorrow, in one another, in the idea that even after we die, someone might remember which rock you hated to sit on and which tree you whispered to before every long walk. There were still threats, of course: disease, hunger, flood, human pettiness in all its creative forms. But we didn't panic now when the river changed course or the rains came too late. We had adaptation baked in. Flood channels, clay reservoirs, songs that warned of dry years, elders who remembered things you hadn't lived through yet. We could feel time growing deep beneath our feet, like roots. And with that depth came choice. We no longer had to say yes to every possibility. We could shape, curate, say, this we keep, this we let go, this we try again, but differently. We weren't trapped by survival anymore. We were editing who we wanted to be. And we wanted to be more than clever mammals with good aim. We wanted meaning. So we built monuments. Large ones, for no reason but beauty, aligned to stars or to silence, or to a shadow that fell once a year in just the right way. Some had no function, but they had presence. And presence, we now understood, was its own kind of power. We buried our dead in circles, danced with feathers stitched to our shoulders, carved spirals that spun in on themselves over and over, like the past trying to remember the future. We were no longer the same people who had chased reindeer across the glacier edge, but we hadn't lost them either. Their marks were still in our hands, their breath still in our songs, their awe still wrapped around our fires. And one evening, when the rains paused and the air smelled like stone, a child asked, "Who was the first?" No one answered, not because we didn't know, but because we all were. The first to wonder, the first to stay, the first to raise walls not out of fear, but out of hope, the first to believe that memory could live in more than the body. We had crossed the threshold, from animal to ancestor, from story to history, from cave to cosmos. And the best part? We didn't even know it yet.